It's my great pleasure and indeed an honour to introduce to you the First Minister of Scotland, Alex Salmond. Very nice to see you. I said discursive, so neither of us has to speak too long without interruption.
You said inordinate length. I was listening.
I wanted to ask you what I think is quite a fundamental question, really. And it's this. Since you became involved in the politics of the national question and associated matters 30 years ago and more, it strikes me that your concept of what independence means has changed, maybe quite significantly. And I just want to ask you to reflect on how the kind of independence that was talked of maybe before you came into the SNP and around the time you did, and the kind that is now spoken of and is in your head has changed. Can you describe what's happened?
Well, I was trying to, I think it was John Maynard Keynes that said, you know, when facts change, you change your mind. There's nothing wrong with changing your mind in politics on that basis. But, I mean, the goal, the objective is the same. I mean, I suppose I could be accused of alarming consistency over the years in politics.
Not on every subject, but we'll come to that later. Anyway.
But broadly, I mean, you know, in terms of pursuing the goal of an independent Scotland, I don't. I mean, the measure of how you get there, of course, is different. I mean, interesting. When I was active in the SNP at first, there was a huge argument raging between what was called fundamentalism and gradualism, which was basically between people who said, look, you should pursue your route to independence through the re-establishment of a Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh, which, you know, for some in this audience might seem kind of strange, but, you know, at that stage, most people didn't think, even if they supported it, there were ever actually going to be one. And others who said, no, you've got to go in one big bang, you know, you've got to win there was 72 seats in Scotland at the time, so you must win 36 seats, and that's the way to do it. So that was the biggest. And I was one of those who said, well, look, there's a lot of advantages in re-establishing a parliament in Scotland, and from that platform, advocating the independence cause. So I would say that actually is the biggest change. Now, there's policy changes, of course. I mean, it would be a kind of strange political party that didn't change its policies occasionally over 30 years. But in terms of pursuing the goal of Scottish independence, I think it's been a much more Jim about how you get there.
Yeah, I was trying to touch on something else. I mean, that is interesting. But you've talked a lot about how the idea of independence as something that 19th century nation states might have approved has changed. Yeah. And it strikes me that, and I remember a speech you made in Belfast some years ago now about, you know, these islands and all the rest of it. And I think that you're getting towards something which is significantly different from the kind of, you know, separate country that was talked about and thought about a generation ago. And you're trying to sort of get that idea in people's minds. And I'm not quite clear yet what it is.
Okay. I don't know, the speech in Belfast, I think that was one I was told to be nice to everybody, so I didn't upset the peace process. So perhaps that's why the language was...
That was a very interesting speech.
I should try not to upset people more then, obviously. But obviously, I mean, look, isn't the divide been the people who see the advantages of being an independent country within the modern world are not object or shouldn't object to the sharing of sovereignty on various aspects. But the key thing about that is you've got the sovereignty to share. It's your decision that you're better to pool sovereignty on certain things. Now, not everybody at Westminster is comfortable with that, incidentally, as we know from the European fissure. But most people in Scotland, actually, regardless of the view of the national question, are relatively, I'm not talking about, in terms of the politics of Scotland or the political parties of Scotland, they're relatively comfortable with that idea. And therefore, we live in a world where it's fundamentally different to be an independent country in the 21st century than it was even in the 20th century. But the idea that makes the idea of independence redundant, of course, is totally belied by the fact that when the United Nations was formed after the Second World War, there was something like 60 countries were in the UN, and now there's 195. So there's been a lot of countries becoming independent over the last 60 years.
That phrase "shared sovereignty" is very interesting. If you want an independent Scotland with its own resources, with its own economy, and so on, you seem to be accepting, particularly by your policy on the pound, that there will be very, very significant elements of shared sovereignty with the UK. How can you be confident that you can negotiate that in the famous 18 months on every front?
Well, the two things. One, the average time of all the countries which have become independent following a referendum over the last 25 years. So the average time between the referendum and the date of independence has been 18 months. But secondly, I rather like the answer that the UK government paid a very eminent international lawyer, Professor James Crawford, an Australian, but a very, very, very well-respected international lawyer, to give their opinion on the legal position as regards the UK and Scotland. And when asked, I can't remember if it was by you, actually, Jim, on the Today programme. It may well have been Jim.
I think it was.
Yes, it was Jim, right, who asked him about the time it would take, to which he replied, the Scottish Government have said 18 months, and that's a realistic estimate. So we owe it to Jim Naughtie.
Well,
the final confirmation
you don't,
that the UK government's own paid legal advisor has said that 18 months is a realistic timetable.
Well, you think Professor James Crawford is a wise man, do you?
Well, there's no doubt that he's a wise man and you're an excellent interviewer.
Well,
I don't know if the
we'll
UK...
parse that one later.
Jim, I was trying to imagine that, whoever paid, well, let's say the Prime Minister was listening to the Day programme and they'd lined up this eminent international lawyer.
Who was supposed to say something different.
Who was supposed to say something entirely different.
Well, okay, but
spluttering in the cornflakes, all sorts of things.
Don't get off the point. You see,
he's an honest man.
Right, he's an honest man, and he's, from what you've said about his view on the 18 months and the average time and so on, you think he's pretty on the ball. Can you enlighten the audience here as to what Professor Crawford said about your idea that your negotiation to go into the EU would be from a position of existing membership rather than from an outside status? Because what Professor Crawford has said in absolute terms is that you're talking rubbish on this matter, and that if there were independence after a yes vote, then Scotland, in effect, would have to negotiate as a new accession country. And I know that you're going to say Europe will want Scotland, and I wouldn't disagree with that for a second. But your friend, Professor Crawford, has blown a hole through your own policy.
No, I don't actually agree with that's what he said, because if you think about it logically, he's talking about the 18-month period to bring yourself into international organisations. And by definition, he's talking about the 18-month period between the date of the referendum this September and the date of Scotland becoming an independent country in the spring of 2016. And this is a point as to whether that 18 months is a sufficient timescale. Now, to quote another, and I don't want to spend the evening quoting eminent experts, but I rather think it's a good idea when you're trying to quote people. The most significant quotes come from people whose eminence is such that they're neutral in the debate and nobody would gainsay it.
Yes.
Or alternatively, as in the case of James Crawford, if you can quote somebody who was paid by the other side, which is, but
hang on, he's an academic at Cambridge University. I mean, the fact that he was engaged by the government to give an opinion doesn't mean he's a paid hack.
No, I'm just saying it's of more influence if you can quote somebody who was lined up by the other side.
I'm simply making the point that you quote him admiringly, and then when he says something you don't like, you say, well, he's paid by the government.
No, listen. I'm saying he's an estimable, honest guy. I think the world of James Crawford. I think he's a highly honest man and eminent academic. I just think that he said this in answer to your penetrating question is quite significant.
Right.
But the person I was going to quote is somebody who, certainly is not a signed-up member of the Yes campaign, is David Edward, who is the only, I think, living British judge, Scottish judge, but British judge as well, who was on the European Court of Justice and hugely eminent beyond any... And he has been almost crusading in this point. I mean, what he says is, look, the mistake that's generally made is people think of the negotiations starting after the date of Scottish independence, which he says is nonsense. He says the United Kingdom, Scotland, the European Union will be legally obliged in good faith to conduct these negotiations from the date of the referendum. In that time, of course, Scotland, by definition, is part of the European Union because we're part of the UK.
Look, I think that the point here is that the extreme position, if you like, that after a yes vote, Scotland would be outside the EU and would have to be, Croatia, and start an accession process.
Floating off to the North Pole, Greenland or something.
Personally, I don't think there's any evidence that would be the case. And that isn't the question. The question is what the terms would be. Now, here we are. We've got the European Union, which, as you always say, and with some force, the European Union has every interest in seeing an independent Scotland, if that's what came about as a result of the referendum, being in the EU for all kinds of reasons that, you could go on about for an hour and a half and perfectly reasonably. The question is, what are the terms? What if the European Union says to you, as it's almost bound to do, right, Salmond, it's the euro for you?
Well, I think I'd probably say Stockholm.
Sweden is the great
on the basis that Sweden is a country bound by the same agreements. It doesn't have a formal opt-out from the euro, but Sweden, by definition, because we know it, is not part of the euro. And the reason that Sweden's not part of the euro, it hasn't joined the European monetary system, which is voluntary. A state has to agree to join the EMS. And one of the conditions for membership of the euro, you have to be in the EMS for 2 years.
It's a preliminary thing.
Yes, so membership of the euro is voluntary, as Sweden indicates and demonstrates. But I don't want to.
And you'd say no.
I don't want to keep citing my opponents, but I mean, must the devil have all the good lines. But David Cameron, when he was busy enunciating a view that lots of countries would never join the euro, didn't just include the countries with a formal opt-out like the UK and Denmark. Said all these other countries probably will never join the euro either. Well, and what he was talking about there is membership of the euro is voluntary.
Right.
And therefore, the idea that Scotland can be dragooned into the euro is also a mistake.
So this is I'm just trying to be clear about this. You have just given a very clear answer that if the EU says...
Don't sound so surprised.
I'm trying to keep every element of surprise out of my voice. If there's a yes vote and the EU says a condition of full membership for an independent Scotland is a commitment to join the euro, you'll say no.
We would not join the euro in the foreseeable future, and nobody can force us into euro, and therefore that won't happen. But can I just point out, and I do it again because I think it's quite a strong theme at the present moment, that the Better Together campaign just signed up another eminent civil servant and academic.
A lot of people being signed up. You mean Jim Gallagher?
Yeah, I know, Jim Gallagher, who before he was signed up for the Better Together campaign wrote in his blog exactly on this point. He said, and I paraphrase him, but I'm paraphrasing him accurately, he said something like, let's get rid of all this nonsense. Scotland would not be excluded from the European Union.
I've already said that.
And would not, I know, and then he went on to say, and would not be forced up to sign up for the euro or Schengen either. So again, I just make the point, if even the Better Together campaign...
Look, we're going to have some questions, and I just want to establish a few facts. So there's absolutely no euro. What if the UK government, influenced by, the First Minister of Wales as well, and indeed the First Minister of Northern Ireland, and it's a political decision, not a decision for Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England, said that they concluded that it was not a good idea for a currency union which would mean that an independent government with its own fiscal policy would be affecting sterling as it was used by the rest of the UK. They might say no. What would you do if they said no in the course of that 18 months to joining a currency union with sterling?
Well, can I say, Jim, why they'll say yes? And that's the argument.
And then you can answer the question after that.
Well, I think you've got to distinguish... when a couple of years back, when I went to see Mervyn King to say, because the Bank of England are the only UK public institution which have agreed, not incidentally to negotiations, but to technical discussions, the sort of discussions we wanted to have with a range of institutions, including the BBC, incidentally. They refused. But the Bank of England, asserting their independence from government, because they're not a department of government, they're a public authority, Mervyn King agreed to these technical discussions. And one of the points he made to me at that meeting, just an observation, he said, of course, one of your difficulties, Alec, is that what people say they'll do now and what they'll say the day after a yes vote are two entirely different things.
That might go for you as well, of course.
Well, yeah, it might, Jim, but I'm just on the point I'm making. You see, I've seen this process before, and there's a great analogy of the referendums that were held in comparison in the 1970s and the one that was held in the 1990s in terms of the process of the devolution bill. In the 1970s, where the parliamentary legislation was before the referendum, there was 5 years, effectively, of blocking and tackling and opposition. Eventually, the referendum was so long after the initial legislation that by then times had changed, everybody had not lost interest, but nonetheless, it was basically talked out in a way. Whereas 1997, the parliamentary bill was held after the referendum. And something which had taken 5 years to go through the House of Commons in the 1970s went through the House of Commons in less than 5 months. Now, the reason in the reason
I'm going to try to hurry
up
up so we can get on other points, but yes.
Well, the reason is that once the decision is taken, as encapsulated in the Edinburgh Agreement, once the decision is taken beyond the politicking and the propaganda, then people sit down and do what's in the best interest, as the Edinburgh Agreement says, of the people of Scotland and the people of the United Kingdom. That's why I rest my case, Jim, that the Stirling area is in the best interests of Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom.
Why, given that you and Nicola Sturgeon and others in your administration talk with a great deal of passion about the horror of weapons of mass destruction, why on earth do you want to be in NATO?
Well, I think, and this is a good example of an issue where I have changed my mind.
Absolutely.
I think when you're looking at independence, you've got two obligations. You've got a primary obligation, which is to the people of Scotland, what you think is in their best interests. And I certainly think it's in the best interest of Scotland to remove weapons of mass destruction from this country and not to waste our share of £100 billion over the next 30 years. But you have another obligation, and that is you have to present your case for independence in a way that doesn't cause great problems for your friends and allies. And it would be not impossible, but it would be problematic, let's put it that way, for the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation to exist on the basis that a large part of the North Atlantic wasn't in it.
So you have
and
accepted...
Scotland's territorial waters extend for a large part of the North Atlantic.
I understand that argument. The problem you've got with that argument is that what you're saying is that you don't like weapons of mass destruction, and you know the Secretary General of NATO doesn't like weapons of mass destruction, and NATO's policy is to eliminate them by talks with everybody who's got them as soon as possible. So there's no argument about that. What you're saying is that you're quite happy to sign up and be part of an organisation that might fire Trident from Cumbria, but if they fire it from 100 miles north, it's an international outrage. That's hypocrisy.
Yeah, I think it would be difficult to locate Trident in Cumbria, just physically. Jump.
Well, there's not much difference. It could be Portsmouth.
It could be done further south, but...
You take the point.
I'll take two issues to that. I mean, there are many countries, 25 of the 28 member countries of NATO do not possess nuclear weapons.
How many countries joined NATO and said as a condition of joining that existing nuclear facilities had to be removed?
Oh, well, there are countries in NATO, like Canada, for example, who've removed their nuclear facilities, Jim. And if other countries don't regard it as incompatible to have that stance and be members of NATO...
You're happy to be part of a nuclear alliance, let's be clear.
I'm happy to advocate members of NATO, membership of NATO, which is absolutely a nuclear alliance. But can I just say, I don't actually necessarily think, although I do accept it would be the choice of the rest of the United Kingdom.
Yes.
I don't think that the idea of expelling these nuclear weapons from Scotland is going to inevitably result in them being relocated in Plymouth, Devonport.
Probably on the east coast of the United States.
Well, if the east coast, I mean, I think it would be. I know that Britain's kept up this pretense of an independent nuclear deterrent for many years, but it would rather be a bit obvious if the independent nuclear deterrent was located in the east coast of the United States.
Maybe, well, yeah.
But I wouldn't take the automatic assumption that they'll be removed. I mean, one of the things that I think prevents, particularly when you talk about Trident renewal, people in Westminster coming to terms with reality on this matter, is it really is quite convenient to have the nuclear weapons far away positioned up the Clyde as opposed to up the River Thames or for that matter even in Plymouth Dam. So I'm not certain that the knock-on effect will be to make a fundamental re-examination of Britain's position as a nuclear state, and even if that doesn't happen, I'd be pretty certain that the next generation of Trident would not go ahead.
I've got some very bright people in the Scottish Government, civil servants. Some, no doubt, profoundly want a yes vote, and some probably profoundly want a no vote, but they're busy working on what would happen. That's their job. Can you put your hand on your heart and say that the people in St Andrew's House believe that the whole business of transforming a 300-year-old state into something different can be completed and signed off in 18 months?
Well, I don't think I've met, certainly the civil servants working on the constitutional process, that there's any doubt they believe that's
a realistic
timescale.
I was talking to your international development minister the other day, and everybody knows that he's a very thoughtful person. And he talked about what would happen with DFID, a very small department, actually, Department for International Development.
I heard the interview. I thought
exactly.
He did very well.
Well, he did extremely well, but it was also very interesting because what he talked was about a process that might take 4, 5, 6, 7 years to get all the pieces in place. And what I'm trying to say to you is that if you bang on about the 18 months, there's a danger from your perspective that people actually won't believe you. And if you said, look, it's going to take a long time, there will be deals to be done, it's going to be a process of transition, more people might believe it, you might even be in the lead, which you're not.
Well, let's talk about what the 18 months is. The 18 months is the time between the referendum and Scotland becoming an independent state. And if you look at all the other countries which have become independent, then the basis of that independence is agreed that allows a country to become independent. But yes, of course, there's a transitional arrangements, which is what he said, where people say, well, that will run jointly, and we may change that over time, or we may stay running it jointly.
The truth is, there'd be a lot of joint arrangements for quite a long time, wouldn't there?
And I hope and believe, and we've indicated some of them, there could be some continuing joint arrangements. I can see things...
Shared sovereignty.
Well, shared sovereignty, but then as we started this conversation, I'm not the one who has misgivings about sharing sovereignty. Well, as long as you start from the position it's your sovereignty to share.
Right. Well, you see, we're back where we started, which I'm very pleased about. Because I know a lot of people who are very, very committed to the yes side of the vote, who say, well, we hope we win, obviously. We hope it happens. But, compared with what we thought a long time ago, it's not independence. It's actually going to be there's going to be quite a lot of stuff going on that isn't like that. The defence thing will be a fudge. All kinds of transitional arrangements will go on for years. Wouldn't it be better if you just came clean on that? I suppose the difficulty is that the people who are keenest on what they believe is fundamental independence think that it's shifted to be something quite different.
Jim, I spent some time over the Christmas break watching Borgen.
As somebody said at your press conference in the White Paper, it was more Borgen than Braveheart, which I thought was a very good line.
But that was probably Nicola Sturgeon's influence, because she's been a long-term Borgen devotee.
You watch The Bridge, it's even better.
I don't have as many holidays as the BBC.
It's on Saturday nights. I don't know what you do on Saturday nights, but I don't know.
But I was watching the Borgen, and I watched the first. I got the box set for my Christmas, and I was watching the first two.
That's the story.
Well, the point I was going to make was, there's a country where the Prime Minister a young, ambitious female politician. Well, I see why
yes.
Nicola Sturgeon thinks.
But she'd like that.
Yeah, well, absolutely. So she should be. But the point I was going to make was, look, in that programme, probably as you've seen it, the Prime Minister is dealing with all sorts of issues, some of which are the ones we deal with in Scotland. Yeah. But many are the ones that we're not allowed to deal with in Scotland. And I suppose if you looked from your perspective, you say, well, Denmark really isn't truly an independent state because it's shared sovereignty over a whole range of things. Even running the krona, its currency, it's pegged the krona to the euro. But as we understand it in the modern world, Denmark is an independent state and proud to be an independent state. And I do think if you went to somebody in Denmark and says, look, you're not really independent, do you not think you should own up and say, we won't be independent anymore, we're more like a kind of devolved part of Greater Europe? I think even the very, very talented Adam Price, the creator of Borgen, would find that a difficult script line because he wouldn't find anybody in that entire Danish parliament who'd be prepared to argue that position.
No doubt we'll be coming back to this in the questions, which will begin just in a second. You are famously quite keen on the sport. Well, I was going to spare your blushes and not mention that. I mean, goodness me, -2 or whatever. -2?
No, yeah.
I was at Easter Road the other week and it wasn't looking very good, I can tell you.
There was a lot of folk there.
There were a lot of folk there. It was full, but most of them weren't supporting your team.
Oh, no, I think, no.
Well, no, what I was going to mention, before we get off on another
ramble.
Let's
be fair about this. If we were allocating points by loyalty or support this season, Hearts would be doing extremely well.
Well, they aren't. You're a fan of the sport of kings.
Which team do you support?
Come on. You're a gambler. You're a gambler politically, and you enjoy horses and you follow the form book. It's a question to which I know I won't get a completely straight answer because it's impossible for you, but I want to try. What are your chances of winning this?
We'll win the referendum, and we'll win the referendum because...
How sure are you?
Oh, I believe we'll win the referendum because one thing, I mean,
when will it change? Because it hasn't changed.
Well, one of the things the opinion polls do wrong, or some of them do, I mean, a number of things we all do wrong, but one thing they do wrong, they ask people, how would you vote tomorrow? Mm-hmm. The referendum isn't tomorrow, it's September. And that's the time scale. And your job, just like in a horse race, and you use the analogy, it doesn't matter who's leading in the home bend. What matters is who's ahead when you get to the post. And the thing I believe will win this campaign for the yes side, and of course it depends on us sticking to this. I believe that in politics, if you have two fundamentally negative campaigns coming up against each other, then the most negative of these campaigns will win. But I also believe if you have a fundamentally negative campaign coming up against a fundamentally positive campaign, then the positive campaign will win. Because at the end of the day, people want to vote for something, not against something.
Thank you very much.